Picture this. You're sitting around the boardroom table staring down the barrel of $1 billion merger, or maybe a massive supply chain pivot. Spread out in front of you are all the documents, the financial dashboards, market graphs, strategic plans, the whole shebang. Honestly, you've got access to more information than literally any generation of business leaders in history. But here's the kicker. Even with all that excellent data, every single major corporate decision begins with one unavoidable element: uncertainty. So today in this explainer, we're diving into a really fascinating concept from a recent briefing on something called the SAGE Corporate Stability Audit. We're going to look at exactly what happens when your dashboard data just isn't enough, and how taking a completely different structural perspective might actually be the secret to navigating these crazy corporate crossroads. Now, as executives, you rely on conventional analytical tools every single day, right? The financial model is totally dialed in, you've got the market research, the forecasts look incredibly polished, your risk registers are fully updated, and hey, you might even be using some highly sophisticated AI analysis to crunch those numbers. And let me be clear, these tools are absolutely crucial. But the briefing we're looking at highlights a really critical reality. Even with all this incredible tech at your fingertips, these tools just don't eliminate the uncertainty around a truly consequential decision. You can literally have all the right data, perfectly organized, and still feel that lingering, gut-wrenching sense of the unknown right before you sign on the dotted line. Because eventually, that data piles up so high it's basically a wall. The spreadsheets just kind of blur together. And then, you hit that moment of pause. The screens freeze. And every leader, at some point, finds themselves asking the exact same question. What are we still not seeing? You know, it's kind of the secret fear of every executive, that sudden realization that throwing more data at a problem doesn't always equal total clarity. Sometimes an overloaded dashboard just creates a ton of extra noise, leaving the actual structural reality of your high-stakes decision completely obscured in the shadows. So the real question is figuring out what on earth to do when all that conventional information still leaves you uncertain. Well, the SAGE framework approaches this problem from a completely different direction. And here's the important part. It doesn't do this by replacing your conventional analysis. No one's telling you to throw out your financial models. Instead, it offers something entirely different, a secondary structural perspective. Imagine taking this chaotic, noisy landscape of raw data and looking at it through a geometric field of structured patterns. It's really all about finding a fresh angle when the traditional view leaves you stuck at a crossroads. Okay, here's where it gets really fascinating. The SAG Corporate Stability Audit is what we call a deterministic decision intelligence system. What it actually does is translate the structural logic of the Indian Ramal tradition into modern corporate decision support. Now, this is a super vital distinction to grasp, so hear me out. This is not some mystical tool, it's definitely not a crystal ball, and it absolutely does not ask any executive to replace hardcore analysis with fortune-telling, not at all. Instead, it's essentially a digital translation of ancient symbolic architecture into a highly rigorous, deterministic computational framework. Basically, SAGE digitizes the geometric, structural logic of Ramal and applies it directly to our modern-day business questions. It builds this bridge between executive decision-making and ancient symbolic architecture, using clean computational diagrams and really precise lines. And the real utility of this approach? It presents a serious, totally grounded business methodology. You don't have to begin with belief. You don't have to subscribe to ancient magic or anything like that. You just apply its structural logic to your present-day challenges to kind of x-ray the underlying architecture of your decision. So how does it actually work? Well, a complex corporate inquiry enters the system. Boom, it's immediately translated into a deterministic canonical Ramal chart. From there, it gets processed through what's called a corporate court, which then generates this really detailed, multidimensional corporate stability profile. That profile is then summarized into a single stability index, and finally, the whole thing culminates in executive intelligence. It's a very precise, structured flow. We're going from an ancient symbolic structure straight to a computational structure, resulting in actionable decision intelligence that you can actually use. Now, that corporate stability profile we just mentioned, it isn't just one simple metric. It's actually a web of 6 interconnected dimensions. We've got organizational foundation, resources and realization, operational resilience, leadership and execution, growth and realization, and finally, hidden exposure. And this multidimensional assessment really matters. Why? Because think about it. A failure in leadership or some sudden hidden exposure isn't always going to show up on a traditional balance sheet. The system looks at the entire organization from multiple structural angles, rather than just spitting out a single isolated prediction. Right at the very center of all this architecture sits the corporate court.
Basically, two witnesses flow into a judge, which culminates in a seal. Now, obviously, there is no literal human judge sitting in a robe here. This is an entirely abstract geometric sequence. And what this sequence does is establish the canonical judicial condition of the inquiry. Put simply, it's a deterministic mathematical flow that essentially locks in the environmental conditions and the structural reality of whatever question you're asking.
Once the corporate court establishes those conditions, all this complex geometry is distilled down into an executive-friendly number, the Corporate Stability Index. So say you get an 82 out of 100. That would signal strong structural stability. This index is essentially summarizing that entire multidimensional profile we just talked about, but operating entirely within the specific conditions set by the court. It's basically translating all that complex structural geometry into a clear, actionable summary. But, and this is an absolutely critical distinction, so don't miss this, this index is not a probability. It is a deterministic summary. It is definitely not a fortune teller's guarantee that you have, say, an exactly 82% chance of success. Sage makes zero claims about predicting the future with absolute certainty. The stability index is a structural calculation pumped out by a deterministic engine. It's a measure of structural soundness. It's absolutely not a roll of the dice.
And that brings us to honestly the most vital boundary in this entire framework, separating the engine from the artificial intelligence. On one side, the deterministic engine handles the math, the chart, the court, the dimensions in that stability index. On the other side, the AI is restricted entirely to interpretation. It manages the synthesis, the risks, the strategic considerations, and the executive narrative. The boundary between these two worlds is absolute. They do not cross over.
To put it as simply as possible, the engine calculates, the AI interprets. The artificial intelligence never, ever decides the math. It doesn't calculate the stability index, and it doesn't influence the court. Its one and only job is to sit safely on the other side of that boundary and translate the deterministic findings of the engine into real executive decision support. It takes that structural math and turns it into a narrative that a leadership team can actually sit down, read, debate, and put to use. So how do you actually test this out? Well, you bring a real, messy, high-stakes boardroom problem to the table. Start with a real decision, like that billion-dollar merger or supply chain pivot we talked about at the very beginning. The SAGE framework is basically challenging skeptical executives to a fascinating intellectual experiment. Again, you don't have to believe in Ramal to explore the method. You literally just read the highlighted structural considerations and see for yourself if it sheds light on a real-world problem you're wrestling with right now. The challenge for any leadership team is pretty straightforward. Step 1, ask a consequential question. Step 2, examine the structure and the evidence that the system outputs. And step 3, evaluate if that second perspective actually gave you an edge. It's just a simple, logical sequence. Treat it like a scientific experiment, rather than some kind of promise of absolute truth. Run a real inquiry through the system, look at the structural output, and just decide for yourself if this brings valuable, previously unseen intelligence to your team. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a little shift in mindset. The goal here isn't really to ask, hey, can this system predict my company's future? Instead, maybe the better question is, what might you be missing? When the dashboards are completely full, but the path forward is still murky, what hidden layers of your own complex decisions are just waiting to be uncovered? I really hope this breakdown sparked some curiosity and gave you a remarkably structured new way to look at uncertainty. Thank you so much for joining me, and hey, keep questioning what your data isn't telling you.